Liz Eshi, and you're listening to AI for That, hosted by myself and Dmitry Shapiro. Today with us, we have Joe Schaeppi, CEO and founder of Solsten. On the website, Solsten is described as the superhuman solution for human-centric experiences, which draws on a deep understanding of human psychology and is amplified by AI. So, Joe, you're going to have to give us a 2-minute rundown of what that means and how it's put into practice.
Sure. So what Solsten really is we can think of it as like a human insight engine. Most of the internet today is behavioral. When we look at science, 1960s is really when we started developing cognitive psychology. It's not that people denied that cognitive psychology existed before that. It was just that we could start measuring it. And we're here and it's 2023 and we're still in the world of a behavioral internet. We're not in a cognitive behavioral internet. So what Solsten really does is we understand the psychological, the cognitive landscape behind audiences. We do this anonymously, and we empower companies, mostly in the gaming space right now, but we're starting to grow outside of that, to holistically understand their audience. So you can design experience to them based on who they are, not just based on their demographics or what they clicked on or what they did. Maybe to give like a brief example, like imagine you're using Google Maps and there's a data scientist on the back end that sees there's 2 data points, and both of them they predicted are going to buy the same thing at the same store on the same day. And both of those data points walk away, do completely different things. We might say that, well, humans are just predictably irrational. That's kind of the behavioral economics version of it. The problem with behavioral economics is that humans are actually very rational within their psychological means. So maybe Solsten knew that user 1 is very forgetful. They have low levels of conscientiousness. They're a pretty forgetful person. So they forgot their wallet, and that's why they didn't make the purchase decision. User 2 might have really high levels of social anxiety. And walking away from a store that's packed full of people is a very rational thing to do if you have social anxiety. So for user 1, maybe there's a reminder, hey, did you remember your wallet? Or for user 2, there's another store, same store, 2 blocks up, not crowded today. So if we think of like how we create experiences today based on what people did, they're very limiting. So that's where Solsten comes in, helps you understand your audience, not just based on what people did or how old they are, which is very limiting in terms of like how we design experiences, but based on who they are and what they need.
How does one index sort of these states of each individual? Like, how are these individuals sort of articulating their cognitive states? Or
if they're socially anxious, or how are you acquiring that?
Yeah. So, when we think of a trait is something like your nose. You wake up the next day, you don't get to wish to have a different nose. You can thank your parents or your grandparents or, whoever. And we also have neurological traits. We have cognitive traits. We have personality traits. And for every one of those, there's different levels of what we call reliability. So things, for example, like extroversion, that's a personality trait. It tends to go down over time as we get older, but it's pretty stable throughout one's life. So you can't like wake up tomorrow and go, you know what? I used to be an extrovert. I got tons of energy around anybody. And that's what a lot of people don't always understand about extroversion is it actually, it's a measure of how much energy we get around people. Like I have friends or know people that they could be in prisons around people they don't like, and they're getting energy around people. Or if you're an introvert, you're like, I just don't get energy around people. I need my time. I need to kind of rejuvenate. Separate story there, like Freud's daughter, it used to be beneficial to be an introvert because it meant, hey, I don't need other people to get energy. I can kind of generate that myself. So there's a history there that's kind of interesting from a psychological perspective. But these traits, these things that are more stable over time, those are kind of the things that we're measuring. So if you look at extroversion as an example, and let's say we measure that in a person, I'll get to how we do that. We're starting to now understand something that is enduring. Like your demographics are not enduring. Your age is going to change. You can change your location. There's a lot of things about your demographics that are not stable. But if you look at certain traits, and some traits for some individuals are more stable than for others, and it kind of depends on your overall personality. So what Solsten does is I was a UX director for McCann Erickson back in like kind of the mid 2000s. And I was doing big projects with like Verizon and Intel and Cisco. And I'm designing these things that are literally impacting hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people in the case of like some of these companies. And I'm like, I literally don't understand who they are and what they need. Okay, design this for a 25-year-old female. What does that mean? She's interested in XYZ. I still don't know what that means. So I really understood that design wise, we need to get a better view of who these people are. So I started exploring, looking at NLP, looking at, can we look at language models? Can we predict personality from what people say, all that kind of stuff? The reality is it's incredibly limiting. Most of what you say is not very indicative of who you are. People modulate their speech based on cultural norms, based on interpersonal relationships, based on the Hawthorne effect. If we're talking to a usability specialist and we know we're being observed, you can see changes in speech, for example. Where at the time I was actually a clinical psychotherapist too, and I was working under one of the top neuropsychologists in the United States. So a lot of what we were doing was neuropsych evals for traumatic brain injuries, a lot of like drug abuse, drug addiction, things like that. These things take 7 hours to complete. They're really robust, but they take a super long time. And looked at, okay, this comes from our world of clinical neuropsych. Humans in general are pretty poor observers of our own cognition. So it's hard for our brain to observe our brain. B, we're also poor observers of each other's cognition. Like Elizabeth and Dmitry, I just don't know. I couldn't write down any aspects of that. I just met you both, but it's pretty challenging. And then C, if we look at neural assessment and what's there's kind of a limitation to self-report, so to speak, as well. Like we can do really pretty good job with building these questionnaires. Like in clinical psychology, you have things like the MMPI, for example, that can measure different personality disorders, things like that. But they do have upward limits. Like a lot of these, their reliability issues, maybe our 80% is something that a question that performs like pretty well. So basically kind of exploring all these different aspects of how do we really understand who we're creating things for? And how do we really understand if they're actually impacting people in a positive or negative way? Like, I don't think the person that designed the like button for Facebook was like, oh man, I'm gonna just screw a bunch of people over in like 8 years from now. They probably said, hey, this is a really good design mechanism and it's working well. And let's see what happens. And the studies from the University of Michigan on Facebook use and depression, like that came out much later. And so how do we enable creators, designers, builders to really understand their audience? So what Solsten does is we deploy an adaptive psychometric assessment in games. Think of it as like the ACT or SAT. As you're taking the questionnaire is learning about you. It's deploying more and more valid items being questions, to measure about 250 different personality traits. So with that being said, we come out with this sort of anonymous person. We never know who the person is in real life. So there's a user ID. There's basically the psychological data on that group. And for that person, that's really our like biological sample. It's not how we scale that across a population. Part of my past is I was an adventure-based psychotherapist. So while I was doing neuro assessment, that's how I was treating patients. And there's a saying that I love, which is like, show me how you play and I'll tell you who you are. And when people play, their histrionics or their masks start to go away. And you get to see pretty authentic behavior that you don't normally see in other places. And that's part of what you do in adventure psychology, is you get to put people in kind of interesting situations where they forget you're completely there. You're like, oh, this is what's going on when you guys are at home and, fighting as a couple or things like that. So I'm happy to give examples there. But what we're doing then is taking all this play behavior from video games, and we're predicting, we put it in taxonomy, and then we predict based on these behaviors, oh, that person rebuilt their base really quick. Is that actual signal for resilience, or is it signal for their level of competitiveness? And how good is that signal? And so in the same way Google basically indexed the internet and made it searchable, what we're doing is indexing all this rich behavior in gaming and making it cognitively understandable, to a point where one of our goals as a company is, in 3 to 5 years from now, could you go to the doctor and play Angry Birds for 5 minutes rather than taking 7 hours of a neuropsych assessment? That sounds a little bit more fun to me.
I agree. I think that sounds more more fun than assessment. So, okay, so these are questions that show up during gameplay or prior to gameplay as some kind of a do this and your gameplay will be better? Like how are they presented to the consumer?
Yeah, so it's a pop-up in the game, and it's, a lot of mobile games, for example, consumers are very interested or very used to taking lots of questionnaires. And this is also part of the story here. When I was at McCann and we would send these kind of things to like Intel customers, you don't get good conversion rates. Like, your average Intel buyer is not like, oh yeah, I want my Intel experience to be that much better. Think of like the pop-ups that they have on YouTube where it's like, answer these 4 questions. You're like, nope. But I can tell you this, if you're a 40-year-old man playing Star Trek and you love Star Trek, and someone says, hey, we want to improve your experience as a player, we have a 10-minute questionnaire. If you're open to taking it, click on this link. So that's how we get the initial, that's basically for our construct validity, our reliability levels. That's kind of our baseline. But what we typically see is about 10% of the daily active users in the game will take this within the first day. So, I mean, we're working with some games that have hundreds of millions of people playing them. So you can work out the math from that. But from that, Solsten's basically at a point where we have the largest known psychological database anyway in the world. So if you're an alien and want to know like what are humans like, what are some personality traits that seem to be consistent across our species, like we could probably hook them up and let them know. So that's how we do the questionnaire.
And the dimensions of this are, you said 250 questions, or does everybody get the same 250 questions, or like how would you describe, and what kind of questions are they? Are they sort of all structured like multiple choice, or are they open answer?
Yeah, so they're very similar. So, if you've ever, maybe if somebody's on a non-clinical, let's say statistically accurate level, like it's somewhat interesting, but things like the Myers-Briggs, for example. So they're on 7-point Likert scales. You're basically answering from time to time, I or over organize things, or I don't know what the item is necessarily. But what our questionnaire is, it's basically an adaptive assessment. So if you think of like when you took the SAT and it goes, ooh, like we're answering these questions adaptively and we're learning about you. Okay, you already know physics really well. We're going to go to math, or we're going to ask you these math questions because of how you answer these. So what it actually pulls from, and this is what I think it's pretty cool, we're at the frontier of assessment. So already Solsten assessments have better reliability and better validity than any assessment I used when I was doing assessment as a clinician. So, medically, it takes like about 10 years from a point of innovation to something getting implemented. And assessment, if we talk about machine learning and AI, it's one of the oldest examples of quote unquote AI. We've been doing machine learning with assessments since Dr. David Weiss, who's at the University of Minnesota. He's the godfather of adaptive testing. It's one of the first examples of machine learning being used. So what we have is this massive item bank. So tons of different questions, but the one thing these questions all have in common is they have very high levels of reliability and validity. Meaning if we ask the question to you to measure, let's say, your level of resilience, and we ask that same question to you again in a year from now, there's above an 80% chance they're going to answer exactly the same. So these questions are very good at performing trait measurement. So very specific to traits. And those 250 traits plus that we're measuring is actually ever increasing. So we kind of think of it as like a cocktail mix. Like maybe you have some base ingredients, you have a whiskey, you have gin, you have this, and then you start to mix those together and you can start to understand, hey, you know what, extroversion plus openness, and then we're just using like the ocean kind of, in the clinical world, it's called the NEO model of personality, which is a well-studied model of personality. And hey, some of these base ingredients, actually from those two, we might be able to measure another trait. So some of them are not directly measured, they're predictably inferred. And that's where the engine gets smarter and smarter and smarter. But yeah, it's a number of questions and it's learning about you as you're taking the assessment. So what it's going to deploy to you is the next best question that is the most accurate for you and reliable for you, that measures the next best trait to basically construct that profile for you.
Mm-hmm. And then does the consumer, sounds like the consumer benefits by their gameplay becoming more nuanced and personalized, but does the consumer sort of have other benefits with this? Meaning, can they sort of get an analysis and insights into themselves from these questions?
Yeah. So when you finish the assessment, because everything's anonymous, we give you a unique ID. So here's your ID. Take that ID. You can plug it into our system. You can see, your motivations, a lot of the data that we're collecting there. So you get a lot of insight there. There's actually some pretty interesting forums where like players have come back and said like, finally, our developers are going to be listening to us, or like, I actually learned a lot of really cool stuff about myself through this. So that's one value to the consumer. Two is basically being able to control their personalization over time. So one of the things Solsten believes is that humans always seek deeper and deeper levels of interactiveness and immersiveness. And gaming is just literally at the very beginning of where we're going to go in the future of digital life, where I think what we think of as games today, play is like a core part of what it means to be human. Like all apes learn through play. That's what we do. We believe as a company that, whether you're Chipotle or whoever, the amount of immersiveness within their experiences will increase, and digital experiences will start to be more like play or more like games. And so as a part of that, getting that ID in the future, what we're building out is you'd be able to then say, I don't want Chipotle to personalize to me, but I do want, I don't know, Activision, or only these games at Activision. I'm really good with that, but not these games. So how are we enabling consumers to be in control of their online reality? So it's not your identity, your personality is a little bit different. So it's sensitive data, but not identifiable data. But how do we enable consumers to be in control of their digital experience and choose, what companies are be able to personalize for them or not? So that's one benefit. And then the other like biggest tangible benefit that happens over and over and over again with every company we work with, like we work with EA and Epic and Supercell and Zynga and all these kind of companies. Like most of the big game developers work with us in some sort of context. What I think is important there is those people creating experiences. If you go into a game studio from 3 years ago and they're like, you know what, we're going to make this really awesome game for 45-year-old females. Like that's literally the discussion. That's literally, and it's a lot of times like, 30 guys on the team. And so this is how we end up with the digital reality that we have today. And now when the discussion becomes, hey, we're going to make this game for, this group that's like really off the charts on altruism, and their biggest values are family and caring about other people. And, here's some of the other stuff we know about them. All of a sudden the experience, what shifts is it becomes so much more relevant for the user. And some of the stuff we measure, we don't just measure trait data. We measure mental health data as well, things like depression, anxiety, stuff like that. So we have this thing called a user-centered score or a player-centered score. And what it's actually measuring is how likely is that person to contribute value for that game over a long period of time, meaning lifetime value, revenue. And additionally, how likely is that game going to give value to that person over time? Is it going to lower their levels of depression? Is it going to lower anxiety? Is it going to increase restfulness of sleep? We look at biopsychosocial factors there. And the higher that score is, and this is, I say this is like the dirty secret we know that's not dirty, is the better or healthier an experience is for your customer, for your human, the longer you're going to extract lifetime value from them. I love to ski. It's one of my passions. By the time I'm 95, I will give more money to the ski industry probably than any other industry. It gives me biological health, social health, psychological health. There's some people that the ski industry is probably not a good idea for. People that might have, there's a threshold of risk taking where that industry can tip over into biological health issues. So, us understanding these things, we were able to measure those. So what it empowers companies to do is build really, really good and what we say healthier experiences for users while keeping the person anonymous, while allowing the customer, like we work with EVE Online, it's a 20-year-old MMO game. They were sitting there going to us, hey, like, how do we get more people through our first time experience? We've been doing this for 20 years. We've tried everything with the ML, with behavioral optimizations, with different offers. Like, what do we do? We saw that there's a bunch of people really high on altruism that weren't making it through that first time user experience. And on our back end through our API, we're just like, allow all those IDs that are high on altruism the first day, to get matched with experiences that are altruistic, like helping a guild member, helping a friend, helping someone else. 20% more people were making it through their first time experience after that. So, the business is able to greatly benefit, and then the consumer, or the player in this case, is able to get experiences that are more in line with who they are.
That makes sense. Have you thought about or experimented with sort of using this data to, not in gaming, but sort of as an interface to, let's say, large language models, to AI?
Yeah, so there's some stuff that I can't totally talk about on the podcast yet. That's on the R&D side of our company, but I can say we have about 2 or 3 projects that are under works there. If we look at, like, it's interesting when we think of the world of AI today, where a lot of people talk about things in terms of like generative AI and these like large like language models. And this is my opinion, so maybe some of the people on this show will get mad at me, but in my opinion, maybe, in my opinion, AI, what we have today anyway, it is not generative. It's synthesizing lots of information. It's not necessarily creating knowledge. It's taking information that's out there and then building upon that. And for us, I talked to some other person, and he's like, oh, you guys are basically a discriminant AI as you exist today. And this generative versus discrimination, I think it's an interesting path to go out on. It's like, okay, sure. In some ways, there's generative stuff that we're learning. In some ways, quote unquote, in some days there's discriminant things. We're discriminating traits as a result of this, and then discriminating what experiences should be adapted based on that. Either way you look at it, one of the things that I think is interesting is all of these learning models. And I think this is, given what, some of the stuff, Dmitry, that you work on, I think this is where there's some really interesting crossover between what we do. One of the things that Solsten puts our foot down with is, you'll see these kind of big reports, or sometimes they're investor reports talking about the state of AI. And then they'll show all these products that, whether it's, these are generating creative things, these are generating this, these are generating that. I have not seen one single game company be able to take something like that and go, this is perfect. We can actually put this in front of users. And it's never going to happen in that context until it gets hooked up with the person on the other end. So even as it is today, you can take like the best artist in the world who's been working with that population or that specific game. And we had this with a game we had at Big Fish called Dungeon Boss. Our best-selling character was this guy, Igorok. And we couldn't figure it out. Is it because he's a snow guy? Is it because he's an ogre? Is it because he's big? It's because and we kept trying different things around that, and we could never beat him. We can never, and it was the same artist, and there's a lot of specificity to it. What was missing for us at Big Fish was not the ability to generate ideas or generate creative. It was the ability to actually understand the consumer on the other end. And what were the resonance factors between those two? So that's where, back to the original question, that's part of what we're really interested in working in. Like, we have a really unique set of data. We have this ability to extract and understand psychological traits at a level that we know is wildly accurate, especially compared to clinical tools like the ones I used to have access to. So how can we start to enable these synthesizers? And that's the part that, these things like Midjourney that synthesize all this information and create output. How can we allow these synthesizers then on the other end to go, well, what's the AI of resonance? So I think that's where that middle section is what Solsten as a company, and healthful resonance specifically. How do we take the human over here, the nouns, the people, places, and things over here, and then how do we allow those to resonate between each other? And in that process, how do we empower the next level of designers, creators, builders to feel like, they're just like magicians. They're able to understand audiences and build things at such a level of craftsmanship that it's like, I was literally able to come up with the perfect gift for you, or this perfect thing for you. That's one of the things that we're working to enable. So given that, I think we're on the legal side, we've done a lot of work with, okay, what does that mean from a ChatGPT perspective, or these kind of, these big language learning, in terms of plugging into them? We have to make sure that everything that we have is safe, and that it's in our, because that's, I think, one of the futures of companies that will succeed in the ML space is they'll be sitting on really unique sets of data that can be trained on. So ChatGPT could obviously train off of what's on the internet. But if I look at my best doctors that I've had in the history of my life, I can think of a great example from a colleague when I used to work in Switzerland. She had seen all of the specialists in the world for an eye problem that she was having. My grandpa was an eye doctor until he was like 90 years old. And she said, I can't solve this thing. I just can't. I said, here, let me check with my grandpa. Sent it over to grandpa, sent her something back. She was Polish. She ended up, there's a big bottle of Polish vodka on my desk the next day. And she's like, I've been trying to solve this for 30 years. Well, that wisdom that my grandpa was able to pass on, that he had learned, that helped her solve her problem, wasn't on the internet. That's a unique data set. And I think a lot of companies have these unique sort of things that we could be training off of. And I think that when you start to have something like that as a business, and then, as you said, Dmitry, well, then how do we play well together with different learning systems? I think that's when things start to become really interesting. And that's where just reading about what you guys do, I'm like, wow, there's some really cool potential crossover between what we're doing at Solsten and what you guys are doing. And I think from an effort perspective, that's Solsten's mission. My mission was always, how do we increase awareness? Because I saw a lot of my patients coming in, I'm like, what was the gap between you being in this chair and not being in this chair? And what's interesting is most of the people that end up in therapy, someone allowed them to become aware that they can be in charge of their destiny in some way, shape, or form. So actually, most of the people that need treatment or need to be in therapy are not in therapy because they lack the awareness to be in therapy. So sometimes I'd say, like, your dad or your parents or these people, like, basically, you're the brave one. You're the one who's here because the people, if everybody who actually needed it was here, then you wouldn't need to be here. So there's a certain level of awareness to like go into that perspective from a first place. And then today, psychological assessment is one of the best tools we have to increase our self-awareness. And so it's like, okay, I become that much more aware of myself. And then therefore I can be much more of a force and effect on my life than, basically kind of getting knocked around by the world. So that's one of Solsten's missions. And if I could do this more by seeing patients every day, we wouldn't be doing this as a company. So that's kind of where we're saying, well, we can't improve it if we can't measure it, like very Lord Kelvin. But we want to be able to measure, like, hey, are we improving things like mindfulness, things like awareness, et cetera? And are these different systems, when we play together and work together, are we moving towards a better version of humanity, or are we moving towards a dystopic version of humanity? And one of our goals is, like, I forget who said it, but they're like, whoever created American cities must hate people, because they're really built around efficiency and cars, where people will go to, like, hey, I was in this little small town in Croatia and it just felt amazing. It's like, that was a town that was built around people, and Croatia, because it was a poor country for a while, didn't rip out streets like a lot of other countries did, and they still have little cities that are built around people. And I think that's really, really powerful. And so if we think of the future of the internet, one of our missions is, how are we building that around people and not necessarily around efficiency? The efficiency is fine too.
There's a lot there. So Dmitry, where do you want to start? Like 3 to 4 questions, but I'll let you go first.
Yeah, look, I agree that being able to understand individual humans more deeply in the form of data can be leveraged to make their experiences, more valuable, whether it's for gaming or shopping or therapy or sort of anything else. This like digitization of the human mind, especially with the tools that are available to us today, that can take sort of all of this messiness, sort of unstructured and even unlabeled sort of raw data, and then make sense of it, is extremely exciting. And we've never sort of been in a world where we had technology that could sort of really leverage that kind of unstructured data and do something with it. And so it's super interesting about how you guys are using that to nuance, gameplay. I wonder how much that could work with actually allowing people to use, let's say, ChatGPT better. When I show up to ChatGPT, it knows nothing about me. Now, recently, they've introduced a feature where I could tell it some things about me, and it sort of remembers that in a global context. So I can say I'm a techie. You can give me technical responses rather than sort of making them in sort of layperson language. But that's sort of very, somewhat superficial. Obviously, humans are much more complicated than that, and we change constantly. Like I just changed, and I just changed again. And if we could capture that data set and then be able to use it to sort of to provide that as context to these new information technologies that are available to us, that we could sort of potentially radically transform their output, because they would all be, let's assume that they know everything. The more they can understand us, the more they can filter everything and give us exactly what we need, for example. I think one of our biggest sort of problems, struggles as humans is, we don't know what we don't know. And that's where all the goodies are, is sort of filling in those things we don't know, like serendipity, surprise. That's what, turns us on when we get that. And so I think there's this opportunity to index the human mind, like you guys are doing and some of the things we're doing, and then be able to, again, use these new technologies to be able to make sense of that, and then sort of personalize the entire world for us, meaning you could extrapolate from that and sort of champion a vision of the internet as we know it today, the web as we know it today, could transform radically, meaning there is no need for humans to create websites for personas or, customer profiles, because those are, as you mentioned, sort of, crude caricatures of humans. Humans are much more complex and diverse than that. And now these technologies can create content on the fly, right? That's what we mean by them being generative. And so each human could get a different sort of package of content created for them based upon many traits, like the ones that you're collecting about them, and then perhaps even sort of an order of magnitude or more, even more sort of nuanced detail about them, where you wouldn't even be able to sort of label them as traits, but they are statistically meaningful as being, differences between humans.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, where we started this conversation, the aspect of psychological assessment back to, we know that humans are poor observers of our own cognition. So if I go to ChatGPT and say, I'm an extrovert and I'm a techie and I'm those sort of things, well, let's talk about extroversion. So I'm half Finnish, right? And if someone's from Oulu and they're from the north of Finland and they go, yeah, I'm like a pretty extroverted person, their perception of extroversion is based on where they grew up and where they lived. Maybe they moved to Venezuela or to Puerto Rico, countries that have higher levels of extroversion. And they're like, yeah, I'm not an extrovert, So our concept of an idea of self is so based off of our experiences, as well as like how honest people are with us. If you look at people that have anger issues, high levels of hostility, these sort of things, tend to have more of a skewed perception of self, because people around them are not open to telling them how and who they are, because there's backlash, there's emotional expense to that. And those are often the people that the world would be best if they were a little bit more self-aware of some of these aspects of self. And so to your point, I think there's a couple parts to that. It's one, just getting better at that, so we can actually look at, who we are, and then we can learn like, hey, I definitely knew I was like that, but I didn't know I was like that. Everyone on our team, we have a lot of the people on the team do lots of assessment work too. And it's just always so fun to see that moment of, wow, like I learned a lot about myself. And in this way, I knew this way, like I knew a little bit, but I can sort of see that reality, and then allowing like a synthesis form. I think that, if ChatGPT or these generative, models, that they're really good at synthesizing a lot of things and then coming up with something. If we look at how we communicate today, I have two people on our team. They both came to me like, we had the exact same conversation. We nodded our heads. We had the same words in the conversation, and then we went off and did two different things. And it's like language is so limiting in our understanding of that language. And a big part of that is, how is that language delivered to us in a way that we actually understand? And so that's the, I think where the crossover between what you were saying, and like it starts with who the person is, and then the next step to that is, well, if there is a version of the world where we're synthesizing information and we're delivering it, well, what role does humanity play in that world? And what role do we want humanity to play in that world?
Mhm.
I think there's a dark version of the Matrix where we could, if we think of like the battle of attention, most people, if you say, hey, do you think you're in control of your attention when you're on social media apps? Be like, yeah. But if you actually measure and monitor their attention, it doesn't take long before there's a passive system that's happening, versus games, where games are active media. So there's a two-way exchange when you're in a video game. It's why you can take kids who have ADHD, for example, put them in front of a math video and watch them spin around a chair for hours, and then put Star Wars in front of them or something that's more interactive like a game. And all of a sudden, like, they're like really focused. The deficit goes away. Cool. Because it's operating around different parts of the brain. And so if we look at the future of the world, it's like, well, what's a role where we're elevating human potential, where we're elevating the human experience? And I think that's one where humans are active participants. And the things that, why I kind of go back to, it's synthetic AI, is because it's taking all the knowledge that's out there, synthesizing it. But then at the end of the day, there's a human that, if they can understand that better and more quickly, can generate and can add. And it's like there's an exponential increase of what humanity could do and achieve. In the same way, like we look back, we're like, okay, we're a 200,000-year-old species. Why is it that in the last 100 years we just got here? It's like language. We had to create languages. That probably took a really long time for us to actually create words and define things. And you look at our history as a species, and well, what can this do to accelerate our potential and put us in our power zone where we can use, and I kind of like, sometimes I like to think of Solsten as like AW rather than AI. It's like artificial wisdom. How are we empowering wisdom rather than just, here's intelligence, here's a thing that you can know, but then what do I do with it? And that's, of all these different machine learning systems, that's the number one question we'll get from a lot of our customers. Hey, we hook these things up, they look really cool, but what do we do with them and how do we know that they work? So that's where I think we're very aligned in terms of that human piece. It's a unsolved part that we found all these new tricks that we can generate now, but what's the human piece?
That makes sense. How many questions does it take for me to be diagnosed an extrovert?
So it completely depends on the person. So I hope that, like, this is probably not too technical, but the way that helps my brain wrap around it is if I think in terms of like principal component analysis, where that first question that you get asked is going to be like the best question that we know from our item bank is the best starter question for you. Now, that might actually be already influenced by some of your gameplay data already. But so that question might be measuring something like your motivation for fearlessness, could be measuring your value you have, could be measuring something like extroversion. So in the case that it is extroversion, we can establish that within like a 70 to 80% certainty within one question. But it might not even be extroversion that's getting measured in the first question. So typically for us to build out a profile at like something like 70% accuracy, we're already there within 7 to 10 questions. But this is the kicker. So if we think of clinical diagnosis, if I'm saying, okay, I'm going to diagnose a person with ADHD and I'm going to prescribe them medication based off that, I'm very not comfortable about doing that with 20% error. So if we're talking about the diagnosis world and the medical world, and that's, by the way, that's where we're at today with most of the best diagnostic tools, is when we come back with that assessment data, we're 80% sure. But if you think of other medical contexts, that would be wild to say, like, I'm going to put you through a surgery, and you know what? I'm only 80% sure that we need to remove your left leg. What? Like that? So that's meant the mental health world. And so
health, I feel like it does feel like we're 80% sure. Like I don't feel like there's a lot of accuracy in that world anyway.
Yeah, that's like, you're totally right. Like, it's separate conversation, but there are certain parts of that world where we can be very accurate. It depends on like the thing we're diagnosing or the surgery. Like, I mean, think about a broken arm, for example. Like we can be 99.999% sure with like certain things. So we're getting better and better there. The medical acceptance criteria is improving, but when it comes to cognitive measurement and ability to measure that, we're wildly separated. And the fact that if you look at ERs in the United States and Europe, about 50% of ER cases are caused or have a mental health component related to them. So we can go down that path pretty quickly, but you go, okay, let's go upstream from this. And part of that just becomes measuring it pretty well. But where we're at in terms of, so we ask about 50 to 60 questions. These are all adaptively deployed. So that's enough for us to get above 75 to 80% in accuracy for hundreds and hundreds of traits. So what we do then is we're kind of like Harry Potter sorting hat. We put people into like-minded groups. So we're never allowing for a Truman Show to happen where it's like ping pong back into your own reality. People purchase and behave in groups. That's part of why phenomena like Game of Thrones became very popular. It's like, if you watched it by yourself and couldn't tell anyone, it's not interesting. So, that's part of why our levels work really well. But then when we tack on the game-based, the play behavior, that's where we're able to actually start to improve validity and accuracy as well. And so now we're having two different sources to kind of talk to each other here. And over time, through all these different games and different sources of behavior, there's 3 billion people in the world that play games every single day right now. That's like 3/4 of the digital population, basically. So, using play to understand people, that's kind of where we're moving towards. And we kind of see it as we're at the forefront of the science of exploring what it means to be human, of human understanding, and allowing let's make the digital world not like the city world where we built it around efficiency. Like, let's not make a digital world that's built around ad clicks and ad revenue. Let's make a digital world that's built around what it means to be human and what's our highest potential. So that's, we'll see what we find on that journey, but that's kind of where we're at today.
Amazing. Yeah. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast and talking about that. Super interesting. Likewise. Important work.
If people want to learn more about what you're doing or participate, where can they go? How can they do that? I mean, I'm incredibly interested. I would love to be analyzed. So how would I do that?
Awesome. Yeah. So you can go to solsten.io to learn more about what we do at Solsten. I think we're having a newsletter that's launching mid-August. So that's a great way to just sign up and see things there. And then if you go to wellbeing.solsten.io, there's actually, it's not our adaptive assessment. It's a static version of what we do, but it's a free psych assessment. We don't track identity or anything like that as a part of it. And you can start to, you can see like your motivations, bunch of cool stuff there. I had a client actually say that this helped her more than her psychologist did through all of COVID. So it's a clinically valid assessment that's free. We launched it as a part of COVID. We wanted to say, like, how do we help people through this period and what can we do as a company? But yeah, we don't keep your information. You get a unique ID at the end of it, so you can pull it up at any time or delete it if you want to.
Okay. And then my final question would be, at what point can I expect the games I'm playing to gently recommend that I go to therapy?
Yeah. So I think we have a partnership that's in place with like Charité and one of our customers. That's Charité is like one of the biggest research hospitals in Germany. So it's moving in that direction. I don't think we're ever going to be able to, on the consumer side, sort of say that exactly. But then on the patient side, I think what's more exciting is, and this is the dream, like this is the scientific frontier that we're on, but I would love to see a world where you could go into the doctor and they hand you a tablet and it's like play Angry Birds for 3 minutes. Maybe we can do that in 5 years. Let's see how the medical industry goes, but it takes a while to start working there. But that's part of what we're working to.
Amazing. Right. Well, thank you again. And I'm sure we will talk soon.
Awesome. Well, yeah, really appreciate you guys having me on, and super cool what you guys are doing as well.